Okay, guys, this is Jorge from the Big Bang Podcast. Today I'm joined by Thomas. He is the co-founder or founder and chairman of the Delphi Group and the author of Revealing the Invisible, a new book he just launched. Thomas, how you doing?
Hey, George, I'm doing great. How you doing today?
Pretty good. Pretty good. So you just launched a new book last week.
Yeah, it just came out last week. Always fun times right after a book launch. You know, you work so hard for so long to get one of these things done, and the real work actually begins after the book is published.
Yeah. So this is not your first time. This is your 11th book, right?
You know what? It's just there's something inside of me that keeps on wanting to get out, and the only way I can keep doing this is by cranking out the books. But look, you know, honestly, for me, this is each time a wonderful journey and adventure and learning. I love to learn, so it's a wonderful way for me to stay in that discipline while also sharing with others some of what I come across. So it's number 11. I don't think it's the last one. I hope it's not. I'm going to keep on cranking them out. But this was by far one of the most enjoyable books that I had written. I learned so much. It's so timely. The topic is so timely, right? We're all talking about this. And everyone, you know, from your grandmother to your grandchild has an opinion about where the world is going when it comes to AI. So it was a very cool book to write.
Okay. So what was the motivation behind writing this particular book?
You know, a lot of what I've seen for so long now, for 6-7 decades, we've been talking about computers getting to the point where they're as intelligent as human beings or surpassing human beings. And I remember many years ago having conversations with Ray Kurzweil about what was then very novel conversation today is standard. You know, the accelerating rate at which technology is increasing, and how it will someday get to the point where it is more intelligent than a human being. But what really triggered this book was that I saw this very unfortunate chemistry that I think we always have when it comes to disruptive innovation, which is that we begin to fear it more than we embrace it. And the scales begin to tip from the promise of AI, how wonderful it will be, sort of the George Jetson view of the world, right? And Rosie, his maid, to this very dystopian, apocalyptic view of the world where AI becomes the overlord and we become part of the Borg. And that began to disturb me, because I think as a civilization, we go through this regularly. Something new comes along, and at first we're thrilled by it, then we fear it terribly. We think it's the end of the world, and then suddenly one day we look back and say, how did we ever live without this? Yes. So simple things, as I would talk to people, simple statistics. For example, the fact that over 1 million people die in car accidents every year, and yet we get so upset when one person tragically, I mean, every death is tragic, right? But when one person is killed, we fail to ignore that what we're moving towards is 1 million people not being killed. That's the inevitable progression of autonomous vehicles. So that really began to bother me, George. And I wanted to write a book that was more balanced in talking about how things like social media, autonomous vehicles, blockchain, AI, all of these will change our lives in a very meaningful, very positive way. It's not Pollyannish, it's not naive. I talk about the risks, but I wanted to provide a balanced assessment of where I think all this is going.
Yeah, no, from my experience, we have to do a lot of education,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of advocacy, while also shining light on the negative side of things.
Yeah.
I mean, because there's always a pros and a cons to everything, and what technology is just a very thin line. And I understand what you're saying. Now, in terms of the benefits of a world that's where computing is really in our context at the 24/7. I mean, it's right now. It is right now.
Right.
But I from what I was reading in your book, I mean, it's gonna go up to 10 times, increase even more, because of, I mean, just from the perspective of the Internet of Things and everything's going to be connected.
Right.
I don't know if have you read this book called Future Crimes?
Yes, I have. It's one of the books that I use I teach a cybersecurity class at Boston University. It's one of the books that I use. It's a fantastic book.
Yeah.
And it scares the daylights out of you, right?
Yeah.
But it gives you a real sense for what the magnitude of cyber crime and cyber warfare is going to be. Already is, but definitely will be.
Yeah, yeah. That was a book that really, I was like, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it really it shifted my perspective in terms of kind of balancing out the views in a utopian and dystopian way.
Yeah.
Uh, Now, how do you view the benefits of being connected?
Yeah. So, so you bring up a really, what I think is one of the central themes in the book, certainly, but one of the central themes in this conversation, and that is this notion of how do we make sense of the negative aspects of AI and any technology. And I think this is a very important point because I'm going to give you a somewhat unorthodox view. My unorthodox view is that everything we think will go wrong and will go bad probably will. Maybe
Yeah.
not in an apocalyptic way, but there will be a lot of disruption that's not positive. AI will be used by terrorists. It will be used by criminals. It will be used by nation states that want to use it in place of warfare. Cyber warfare will become the norm. So if all this is going to happen, then how in the world, where do I get off saying that AI is a good thing? Should we just put the brakes on? Well, what we fail to understand is that progress is not the result of any technology being less disruptive. It's a matter of us creating more value with that same technology. So I remember years ago having a conversation with Steve Wozniak at an event that we both happened to be at, and we were talking about AI, and he said to me something along the lines of, all we need to do with any new technology is create a net positive effect, right? Think of it as profit, the profit of progress. And from a cosmotic sort of approach, looking at the cosmos in general, the only reason that you and I exist and have this conversation is because at the moment of the Big Bang, there was one more part per billion of matter than antimatter, right? So the whole universe destroyed itself except for that 1 part per billion, which is you and I and everything else that exists in the universe. That's all we have to do with technology is create more value than we do destructive power. So nuclear warfare, this week we'll be talking all about the arms race, and we see the repercussions of it. Almost 100 years later, we're still dealing with nuclear arms. It's not a matter of getting rid of nukes. It's a matter of creating more positive progress with that same technology. So countless lives have been saved through nuclear medicine, right? So we have to look at both sides of that equation. That's all I'm saying. It's not that the bad side isn't as bad as we think it is. It probably is, maybe even worse than we think it is. It's that the good side is better than what we think it is, better than what we can imagine it being. So if I can save 1 million lives through autonomous vehicles, you're damn straight I'm going to do it. There's no reason not to do it. Will there be other ways that AI is used to, in more destructive and evil ways? Of course there will. So to me, that's the point. Is let's open our minds and keep our minds open to the net positive gain. And as we keep searching that out, that's how progress in technology, in a society, in a nation state, whatever, that's how it occurs. So that's a very important point in the book that we bring up very, very early on. Is what's the net positive effect of technology such as AI? So your question is a really cool one. It's one that gets very philosophical. I don't want to get too far down that path, but in the book we do talk about it that way. It's a very important question. It's a philosophical question, but it's also a mechanical question, right? What are the ways in which we will see value? How will we experience it? Can we sort of project and predict what that value will be, which we can with autonomous vehicles? And how will that change our lives for the better, even though all the bad stuff may still exist?
Yeah, so I agree with what you're saying. The way I've explained it to people from our perspective, at least here in the tech, is that the more of us that are looking at this in a positive way and
Right.
approach it that way, then we are already ahead of the negatives.
Exactly.
I mean, we're already ahead of the negatives because it's very easy to think of the negatives. It's very easy to fall into it.
Always.
Um,
The reason we shouldn't move forward is always much clearer than the reason that we should, which is usually
yeah,
why it takes some sort of a crisis to sort of get you over.
yeah,
In the book, we talk about the downing of Korean Air 007, a horrible, horrible incident, right? And what we forget is that this was not at a very good time, right? This was a serious issue that could have led to a nuclear escalation. It didn't, as we know now. But when a Russian fighter jet shoots down a commercial airliner, that's a crisis. And what came out of that crisis was that Reagan said, you know what? The military has access to GPS info, and private industry doesn't. The reason that 007 ended up in Soviet airspace was because they didn't have access to GPS. They had to use very archaic, at the time, tools by which to figure out where they were. The fighter jet didn't. You know, the Russians knew that this plane had drifted into their airspace. The pilot of the commercial airliner didn't know that. So Reagan said, let's make GPS open to private industry. So it took a crisis of that magnitude to get us to realize, you know, GPS may sound threatening. There may be a big brother element to it. But, you know, today, you and I and everyone else who uses it can't imagine being without it from a safety standpoint, from a convenience standpoint, from so many different ways it has enhanced and changed our lives. But it sometimes takes that kind of a crisis to get you to realize that the benefit is greater than the liability.
Now, are, you know, for example, these crises, are they, I mean, sometimes they're happening accidentally and then just the thing happens. But are there companies that create these crises to generate this effect? You know?
So now we get into that sort of that fringe, that periphery of conspiracy theories, right? Which I never buy into, because I don't think anyone is smart enough on that scale to truly have a conspiratorial, environment that lives with expectations. But that said, let's leave conspiracy out of it. Let's just talk about our large companies like Facebook, by way of example, because that's the example that we're all using today. Are they maybe moving us by making this more visible, more conversational? Are they moving us in a direction where we have to face the issue? And the answer to that is yes. Are they doing it consciously, maliciously, conspiratorially? No. I think it's the nature of how this industry is growing up.
Yeah.
So again, let me give you a very unorthodox way to look at this. Rather than saying Facebook has too much information about me, and this is really going to upset a lot of people when they hear it, but bear with me. What if I said Facebook doesn't have enough information about me? Stop and think about this, because let me give you a very trivial example, and I'll even tie it back to what you're doing with your company, because I think what you're doing is very, very cool. If I have a private assistant, the more I tell that assistant, the more effective he or she will be. If I tell them just 10% of what I need to, they're going to make all kinds of mistakes. They'll book me on the wrong flights. They won't get my schedule. They'll create havoc in my life because they don't know me enough. So my fear of telling them too much is actually going to stand in the way of them being a productive assistant. What if I applied that same sort of reasoning to facial recognition or to social media? If you have just enough about me, but somehow I constrain the amount of data you can have, you'll have a lot of false positives. You'll have a lot of situations where you're not coming up with correct results. And I'll blame your technology or I'll blame social media. But the reality is, if you had more data, you'd actually be more precise and more likely to have positive outcomes. So I think we're at this very interesting point where we're struggling with how much do we give up? What's the value in giving it up? And what we get is the fear in giving it up. What we don't get is the value that's coming in return to us. So I can absolutely imagine 10, 20 years down the road, you know, my children, or hopefully I will as well, looking back and saying, my God, I drove in vehicles that killed, you know, had a good chance of killing myself in those vehicles. I used to go out and do my own shopping, and I used to have to spend hours and hours in stores. What a waste of time that was. Not that you won't do that for joy. I can see myself driving for pleasure, or I can see myself going shopping for pleasure, but I won't have to do that, right? I won't have to go to the supermarket and spend 2 hours a week walking up and down aisles trying to find things. All of these are ways that my life will be enhanced. And look, the greatest gift you can give me is my time.
Yeah.
So AI, if the things that you're doing with AI, if the things that the social media is doing with capturing my behavior, if those give me back time, that's an enormous gift back to me. And that's what will happen because of these technologies. We will get safety, we will get certainty, and we will get time back in our lives. And we'll think of the way we used to live and wonder why we wasted so much of our life on meaningless activities. But, and here's the big but the question everyone says is, well, wait a minute, you know, it's meaningful to go to the grocery store. It's meaningful to drive my car. I agree. In today's context, is there a chance you might find more meaningful things to do with that same amount of time? I think the answer is probably yes. So we don't quite visualize the value of progress very well. We visualize the threat of it, but not the value. So going back to my original comment, what if it's just that we don't have enough data to make good decisions all the time? And that's why it's creepy. It's outrageous to hear someone say that, but I really believe that that's kind of where we are.
Yeah, no, I agree with what you're saying. From a technology standpoint, I mean, you and I both know people. I'm pretty sure you know people who still don't buy online because they're like, they feel like as though they're giving away something.
Right.
And it's
Right.
not a lot, and it's really not a lot. And I tell people I've been buying my stuff on Amazon since I could, since I could,
Hmm.
because I didn't want to go to the store. I found it very easy to do the buys. It's like right there. And then I tell my mom, I'm saying, Mom, Amazon knows me better than you do.
That's,
You know, it's ridiculous, but it's true because I get recommendations on my phone pretty much every day now, and I'm not gonna. I don't say I'll buy something every day, but maybe once or twice a week I'm buying something for Amazon because I'm like, Jesus Christ, this is nuts. But at the
right.
same time, I really want to do it. It's not because Amazon is poking me to do it. It's because I mean, to a certain point, it's one's own decision to do it.
Right.
Now, when it comes to the topic of convenience and you know, safety and security, how do you define hyper personalization?
Yeah. So we most of us have some familiarity with personalization or customization. Many things that we buy today, from automobiles to tailored clothing, are customized or personalized. The difference is when you take the leap to hyper personalization, what you're saying is there are elements about your behavior that constitute certain needs, desires, certain aspects of your life that even you may not be able to quantify precisely. And as a result of understanding those behaviors, I can hyper personalize an experience or a product or a service to those behaviors. So what this means is, let me give you an example tied back to what you were just saying about Amazon. So picture this, and again, a lot of this sounds like heresy, but just follow with me, just kind of play with the idea for a minute. Picture this: you arrive home one day, and on your doorstep is a big brown box from Amazon, and you think to yourself, I haven't ordered anything lately. And you bring the box inside, you open it up, and in your box is vacation clothing. I'm going on vacation next week. There's a vacation clothing. I think, oh my goodness, I didn't order this vacation clothing, but you know what? This is exactly what I need right now because I haven't had time to go shopping. I've been eating a little less healthy than I should be, so I put on a couple of inches of my waistline, and these shorts fit perfectly, even despite that. So I'm describing a scenario here which sounds a bit ludicrous given the way that we today understand the consumer, but this is exactly what Amazon is heading towards. This predictive personalization, that's hyper-personalized. It's describing you in ways that you might not even necessarily be able to describe yourself. So if you went to Macy's to buy those same clothes today, you're probably going to put on a pair of shorts that are the same waist size that you had last summer, even though you've gained a few inches. Macy's knows you better than you know yourself.
Yeah.
Private personalization, they should be able to recommend the clothes that fit you best. So there's an element of this where I think we fear giving up the control. We want to be able to control that. But at the same time, if I had a personal shopper that did this for me, I would love that. Who wouldn't love that, right? Who takes care of all that for me? So hyper-personalization is creating that sort of personalized experience at a level where even you yourself could not necessarily achieve the same level of customization, of bespoke product or service. And again, it sounds a bit strange for us today because we haven't experienced it yet, but it is absolutely the direction that AI is going with predictive analytics, right? Understand you and describe you better than you can even describe yourself.
Yeah, you know, so it's kind of like the perspective of ambient computing. You know, there's a lot of movies that kind of show these scenarios that you're talking about. I mean, the ones that come to mind for me are you know, the movie Her,
Yes.
Minority Report, which is a little older one.
Right.
I mean, there's a lot of them. The point where, I mean, it doesn't matter where you are. If there's a sensor, a scanner, something that's scanning you, that you showed up, something, I mean, it'll recognize and it'll shift everything to make it feel as though this is your store. I mean, we're catering the store for you. We're catering the restaurant for you. We're doing everything for you.
That's right. Right.
And for people, it's very hard to imagine that happening. I mean, even though we're moving that way, I mean, there's a little stuff that needs to happen still before it happens fully, but that's really where we're moving. Now, another question was, so from a business standpoint, we kind of know the big ones, right? So they call them GAFA, or Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon, and then also Microsoft and a few others, right? They kind of dominate all these different technologies.
Yeah.
How does a non-GAFA company enter the game.
Yeah, I mean, so I would add Netflix to that mix, by the way,
Yeah,
too.
yeah, that's true.
Another one that is often put into that same category, right? So, wow, this is a really good question. I'll tell you why. Because the point we're at right now, especially with the recent conversation around Cambridge Analytica and Facebook and regulation, what's going on in Europe with privacy, all this is creating a somewhat dangerous environment. And the danger, and this has been talked about, and most folks are familiar with some aspect of this conversation. The danger is that those large incumbents, if we can call them incumbents at this point, Apple certainly is, Facebook certainly is, Google certainly is, Microsoft certainly is, Netflix is, are in a position where they cannot be displaced. Yeah. So the question is, will they control now the rate of innovation? Is innovation only going to come from those organizations? Because smaller organizations can't afford the risk or the liability imposed by regulation, whether it be global regulations or nation state or communities such as Europe. The problem with the small organizations is that the risk is too great. I can be put out of business by making a single mistake. I can't afford to pay the fines or to be dragged through the process of not being able to comply. And that's a real concern, because we're at a point where I think there's so much more to innovate in terms of how we deal with these issues, how we deal with what we call in the book our digital selves. I really do believe that at the end of the day, I should own my digital self. It shouldn't be owned by Facebook or Microsoft or Apple or pieces of it by all the above. I should own that. Whether there's value coming back to me in terms of monetary value, I'm not sure about that, but I should at least control the distribution of it and who gets to access it. So what I'm turning around is the whole notion of today signing over all of my rights when I sign the terms and conditions, implicitly or explicitly sign those terms and conditions. I'm turning that around saying, you know what, here are my terms and conditions. Do you want to accept them? If you do, then I'll be one of your customers or your members, depending on the type of service. I'd hate to see that slow down because of the way in which these large players are able to protect themselves and insulate themselves, and as a result, throttle effectively the rate of innovation. Now, they would tell you, look, we're not throttling it. We want to innovate as much as we ever have. Understood, but you know what? At the end of the day, the business reality is that might very well be what happens. So getting back to your original question, so what do the smaller companies do to play in that game? I wish I had a single, answer, a panacea for you here. I don't. What I do know is that we need to continue investing in that ground level or ground zero sort of innovation, where the real breakthroughs I think are going to happen. It's not clear to me whether that's something that we protect through legal or regulatory means, or whether it's just organic and we allow the market to continue, seething in some fashion and pull back on regulation. So we're not protecting the large incumbents as much. At the end of the day, I think this is a conversation that needs much more time to develop. If I had to say right now, I think the best thing we can do for the smaller companies is not put in place so much regulation that we do insulate and protect those large players. Unfortunately, if you look at the Zuckerberg testimony and the recordings of that testimony, our legislators know so little about this.
Yeah.
And having them even come close to trying to protect us from it is a frightening thought. More frightening than what Facebook is doing, frankly. So I think we're in a very sort of precarious, chaotic period right now. If we rush to regulation, what Europe did, I think, and people will argue with me, but I think it was a rush to regulation. I think it was a knee-jerk reaction. So we have to be careful not to swing that pendulum too far over to the protecting society side, because in doing so, I think we will stifle a lot of great ideas that come from small companies. That's the best I can make of it, George. It's an interesting, fascinating time from that standpoint, because you have this classic sort of innovator's dilemma. The incumbents want to protect themselves. Of course, they want to innovate, but not that fast. And there's a lot of potential innovation coming from the ground floor, or very organic innovation, that I think could have a huge impact on the industry. And we might very well be stifling it before it can get out of its embryonic stage.
Yeah, I saw, recently, this is probably a few weeks ago, right after the whole Cambridge Analytica thing happened. I started seeing a lot of messages on my feed, basically saying I'm switching to Firefox. Goodbye Google
Right.
Chrome.
Right.
Um, I've been using Firefox, and I was user number 23 of Firefox.
Wow. Wow.
That's a long time ago.
Man, you're not that old. How can you? That's not possible. You're not that old.
Yeah, probably like 10 years ago or something. um, so for me, the decision to use Firefox had nothing to do with back then, and never had anything to do with the security part.
Right.
Versus Internet Explorer. It had much more to do with the speed of it, and also the blocking of stuff, right? So the blocking of pop-ups and all that stuff, and never had anything to do with they take care of my information. But then once you start seeing all the information that Google pulls from you, and I don't know if you've done the process of looking what they have. I mean, it's you're like, if you've never seen it or you're not aware of it, you'll be like, goodbye Google, right?
Right.
I mean, you'll be scared of it, but for those of us who work in these things, it's kind of like, oh, that's it, yeah, that's great, and you kind of become curious about it, or at least I did.
Right.
But then I started seeing people started jumping on Firefox because Firefox does not share your information. So I saw that as you're saying, kind of like part of the process that we're living in,
Right.
where people are kind of like what's going on? They're kind of scared of it, and you start seeing these reactions. And where I want to go with this comment is you mentioned I believe it's an article you wrote where you say that it's very difficult to predict people's behavior as opposed to predict technological progress.
Right.
Can you elaborate on that thought?
Yeah, so this is another one of those fascinating topics. So in the book, the example we use in the book is for folks that remember this, in the 1990s, AT&T ran a series of ads. It was called the You Will ad campaign. A big, capital letters, You Will. And the whole notion of You Will was, at some point in the future, this is how you will live your life. And it was meant to be a very positive, uplifting message. People saw You Will as a threat. You will work 24/7. You will be connected all the time. You will have a mobile device always on your person. Now, today I say those things and we say, yeah, and that's exactly the way I do live my life. I joke that, I forget what the numbers are off the top of my head, but depending on the generation, at least 20% of us actually sleep with this thing in our bed or on the nightstand next to our bed. The rest of us have it somewhere nearby, just in case, at 2 a.m. in the morning, the thing rings. Very few people shut that off. So we are all connected. So going back to ATT's ads. So in that series of ads, I mean, look it up on the web if you haven't seen this in a while, or if you've never seen it. They were the most amazingly prescient and well done ads, better than any science fiction movie of the time. They had Netflix, to the point where you look at it and say, my God, that really is Netflix today. That's exactly what it looks like. They had GPS in automobiles. They had electronic medical records. They had tablet computing. Everything that we use today was in that series of ads in 1993. I mean, this is spooky, crazy, prescient. And yet, the point we make in the book is AT&T did not bring a single one of those technologies to the marketplace. So how is that possible? How can you get technology that well and not bring it to the market and monetize it? And the folks at AT&T will tell you, look, at the time, we knew this stuff would happen, but we thought it would be, anecdotal, interesting. It would take a long, long time for it to really sort of take off. And we didn't see a business opportunity there. We'll create the infrastructure for it, let someone else take the risk of the business opportunity on. So we see how fast technology moves, and we can usually predict the rate of technology's movement. What we can't predict is the way that we will apply that technology. So in the AT&T ads, when they showed the tablet, the voiceover, it was Tom Selleck doing the voiceover, by the way. Tom Selleck said, you will fax from the beach. It's like, who faxes from the beach? I use my cell phone, I talk, I text, I communicate. We never would have imagined behaviorally how this would integrate with us and change us. So the innovation goes both ways, right? I shape the technology shapes me. I think it was Thoreau that said, men have become the tools of their tools. It's not that dark. It's a symbiotic relationship. We teach the technology and it evolves, and it teaches us and we evolve. That sort of behavioral math is impossible to put into a formula. None of us know, and going back to the very early part of this Google Hangout, the conversation we were having, none of us know what that value will really look like. It won't be faxing from the beach. It'll be talking to your grandchild because you can't fly 3,000 miles to be with them, a few years after they're born and hearing their first words. That's the value. So these are behavioral, emotional issues. They're not driven by technology. They're driven by our human emotions and our human behaviors. And those are nearly, I say nearly because I don't want to give up entirely on this, but they're nearly impossible to predict. They're evolutionary. They morph and they manifest themselves in ways that we can't even begin to imagine. So what do you learn from that? What you learn, I think, as a technology company is it's great to bet on the technology, but what you have to be most cognizant of and most aware of are the behavioral changes, both positive changes and negative changes. How are people reacting to my technology? And how do I then pivot to create a solution, a product, which is more appropriate to the behavioral change that's not driven just by the technology? And that's the key. Successful companies pivot over and over and over again. They don't get stuck on the original idea. As technically sound and elegant as it may have been, they realize that that idea is just a seed, the irritant in the oyster that creates the pearl, right? Their idea is just that irritant. The pearl needs a lot more contextual, existential input in order to ultimately take shape. And that's where a dance, a synergy with the market is so critical, I think, for the evolution of any of these technologies. So take Facebook. The best thing Facebook can say when people get upset and pissed off at Facebook is, you're right. To some degree, Zuckerberg was trying to do that, I think. I think it could have been done even more forcefully than it was, but you're right. We screwed up. And Zuckerberg has done that in the past, and Netflix has done this in the past. Because the only certainty is that you will screw up, that your product as it stands today is not what it will be 5, 10, 15 years from now. It shouldn't. So it's that behavioral synergy with the marketplace that I think is most important to understand. And that's where you negotiate things like privacy, where you negotiate things like, how do I own my digital self, and what kinds of terms and conditions do we agree to? All this stuff has to be done organically, and it has to be done through this behavioral evolution, which is why, going back to my earlier point, I'm so concerned about being overly regulated far too early, because then you stifle the movement. It's kind of like having, if you want to think of the metaphor of a dance, it's kind of like putting me into an armored suit at that point. My movement is stifled and limited. The marketplace can't sufficiently express its behavior because the regulations don't allow it to. So that's where, and we spend a lot of time in the book talking about the importance of the behavioral piece of this. And what I love most about this topic of behavior is it's not just human behavior. The machines now are starting to exhibit behavior. That's the cool part. So you talk about the movie Her. Wow. I mean, we're at that point. Very soon will be. We're just, we're years away, a few years away from, Google demonstrated this at their I/O conference, years away from having true conversations with machines.
Yeah.
How odd will that be? Right. And then, do I know if you're a machine or not? You have to disclose that you're a machine if you are. How cool is all that going to be? And we're just about that precipice of being able to have those kinds of conversations. The behavior is not just human behavior; it's machine behavior, and ultimately the two are going to have to work and collaborate as one.
So from the perspective of behavior, I think it also has to do with the cultural aspect of specific regions. For example, Japan, for them, it's normal to walk around in a restaurant and have a robot serve them food, or not serve them, but at least put the food in front of them, right? Whereas over here, it's kind of weird. It's still weird. You see it more like, whoa, like what's going on, right? You've seen it in movies, but seeing it in person is kind of weird. For example, sometimes you can't predict these things. I mean, going back to your comment about not being unable to predict, or not being unable, but not completely predict a certain behavior. Right. I mean, who would have known that Estonia would be would be breaking pretty much every rule in the book as to how to quote unquote govern. I mean, you and I can now be citizens of Estonia if we wish.
Right. Yeah. No. And by the way, there's another example of how that was brought on by crisis, because Estonia was literally taken down by hackers, and that was really the impetus, the incentive to do that. It's funny, this cultural behavioral chemistry is one that we often ignore at our own peril. Yeah. Even with smartphones and with cell phones, even before smartphones or cell phones, I so recall traveling back and forth to Europe. It was totally okay to have this on the dinner table or at a restaurant. There was nothing about the etiquette of it that was seen negatively. But you'd come back to the States and people would look at you very oddly if you pulled out your cell phone at a restaurant. It wasn't cool. You wouldn't do that. That was a very, very inappropriate behavior. Not so much in Europe. So it's funny to see how cultural behaviors and norms cut both ways here. There's no single culture that has sort of a monopoly on their ability to adopt technology. So we're seeing, who would have thought Estonia, right? Yeah. What is true, however, is, and you and I have talked about this before, is that if you're a technology company, you're a global company. You sort of have to, by definition. So you need to understand these cultural nuances because they're huge. They make a big, big difference. I mean, in what you're doing with facial recognition and understanding emotions and micro gestures, those vary dramatically. I mean, what I'm doing right now seems so natural to someone who might be in the Western part of the world, specifically maybe Latin America or North America. But even there, I'm starting to get touchy because even Canadian to Mexico gesturing and facial expressions change in ways that we're not aware of. I grew up in the Greek culture. I grew up in the American culture. When I go from one to the other, and I'm fluent in both languages, I have to instantly change everything about my persona. If I don't, there'll be an incongruity there. I will look like a poorly dubbed foreign movie, right? So why do your expressions and your hand gestures not match what you're saying? So I couldn't do anything the same way, but my mind automatically maps. Technology doesn't do that very well. So to even have an AV, you can't have an autonomous vehicle that drives the same way in Boston, that does in Singapore, that it does in Bangalore, or in Mexico City for that matter. I mean, that would be absurd, right? So I love to get people to think about these. I'm so glad you asked that cultural question because I say to them, look, if you've ever you've gone on vacation and driven in a country and then come back to the States, you realize how different your driving has to be to survive in each of those contexts, whether it's Italy or it could be Rome, it could be Athens, it could be Paris. It doesn't matter. You have to adapt to the local sort of cultural approach to that activity. And when we're still, I think, unfortunately, a bit too blind as technologists to the importance of that. But you're right; it's hugely important, and I think it's a big, big stumbling block in many ways. And it might be. I just published a research report with a colleague in India about transportation in the year 2050. And one of the things that we discovered in our research is that, there might be more likelihood for AVs to become widely adopted in India before they do in the US. And a lot of this because of cultural reasons. So no one country has a monopoly on these topics and technologies. And no one country can sit back and say, let me wait and see. Because that will put you at a huge global disadvantage, I'm convinced, in just 1 or 2 decades time. So it's probably the biggest arms race we've ever seen, and there's a lot of culture involved in how each part of the world approaches these sorts of technologies and their solutions. It's fast.
Yeah. So from our perspective here at NITEC, even though we're based in Mexico, Tijuana. Our culture is not, I always say that Mexico is kind of like, it lays in the laggard, in terms of adoption. Yeah. And I don't say that because I want to be negative about the country. It's just the behavior. I mean, that's what it is. It's a cultural thing. So for us, or at least from my perspective, when I started, took over the reins here, for me, it was like, if you guys created this technology to focus on Mexico, I was like, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying it's going to take a while,
right? Because
it's a cultural behavior, and it's going to take us a lot more effort to get some type of adoption, because it's just a cultural thing. It's a cultural thing. It's not a people thing. It's not oh, you guys are slower than everybody else. It's more like everybody is a little bit slower, and even if you jump from Tijuana to Mexico City, which Mexico City is like the equivalent of New York in Mexico, it's a hot spot. It's multicultural. Still, there's barriers to adoption because of the cultural thing, and also the quote unquote not being pioneering new technology, so they see us kind of like the outsiders,
Mhm.
like the like you guys are weird,
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean it's insane, and going back to your point about you kind of spending time in Greek and then or Greece or and then the U.S., me in Mexico and then the U.S. is I have to do something similar myself with the language.
Yeah.
The way I express those certain things, it changes things, and some of that's carried over to my when I spend time in Mexico because I think in English.
Yeah.
I
Right.
read everything in English, so it's like I have to do a lot of work to to
Yeah.
frame it in a way that Mexicans will catch it.
Yeah, and so let me bring up a point here, which I think is incredibly fascinating to me. I think a lot of folks will find this interesting as well. One of the areas where AI can have a huge impact, and I see virtually no one talking about this, but being multicultural, it's always been sort of in the back of my head when I think about AI. When I today try to carry on a conversation with someone from a different culture whose native tongue is not English, and who has less than, let's say, incredible proficiency with English, I always find myself trying to second guess what they really mean, right?
Okay.
And that creates a lot of miscommunication. And I think we downplay the tremendous damage and value erosion caused by that miscommunication, right? In small ways and big ways. So we make fun of it if you try to use a call center for support and you get someone in a different part of the world that doesn't understand your culture. It's very frustrating because there's nuances in how we deal with people that don't get conveyed just in language. So what if AI? So let me bring up the notion of this universal translator, right? So we have universal translators that can translate the words, but we all know that translating the words does not translate meaning.
Yeah.
What if I had AI that allowed me to not just translate the words, but to truly translate the meaning? So I take the meaning from one culture, which I understand intimately because the AI is built to get the meaning, and then I convert the meaning into the new meaning and then into the words. Can you imagine what that would do for us in civilization? I mean, we can say that we can all speak English, but the reality is, if you're not raised in a certain language, there's nuance of that language that you just don't get.
Yeah.
You'll never get without years and years and decades perhaps, and if you're not born into it, maybe never get that nuance. But AI could train itself to understand that nuance. So we would have, for the first time, a truly global civilization that can communicate across all these barriers. So here's an example of value. We don't talk about it. We don't see it. We haven't experienced it. Therefore, we don't factor it into the equation. But if we had that, I think it would change the world in a way. It would prevent conflict. It would create commerce that's frictionless. It would do so much that today we struggle with day in, day out. And that is one of those areas we would look back on and we would say in 30, 40 years, how did you guys ever support a civilization without being able to communicate in this way? How is that even possible? Right.
Yeah.
So this cultural thing is a very important issue, and it's not often enough given, I think, adequate consideration.
Yeah. So I have another company where we do the natural language processing part. So I've explored both perspectives now with the emotion thing here in the tech and also the language part, and working with. I mean, it's a very basic story, but it tells you everything of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
I have a client in the U.S. who caters to both Latin America and also the U.S. So when you're talking, or they're talking to a quote unquote chatbot online, which is acting like a person.
Right.
There's people who come from. So Latin America has various. I mean, I can talk to somebody from Peru in Spanish, Colombia, Argentina, because they speak, certain, we understand ourselves. But when it comes to the like the slang or the real specific stuff, you're still wondering, well, what does that mean? So when you get messages online, talking about the cultural thing, if you don't train the thing to recognize all these different variants of how people express themselves, the thing is like wonder itself, like doesn't do anything. I don't understand what you're saying, right? Because there's hitting meaning in ways people express themselves. And this is going down to the specifics, not even the general stuff. And that's one of the things that the main obstacles with we have to overcome, enable for these things to become more ubiquitous and people will not get frustrated with them.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
then you take this to another level and you talk about, like you were saying with the Google example, the voice, which is, I think I've seen in Skype that since Microsoft bought Skype, they've implemented the instant translation. So when you're talking to somebody in China, you can read the text what they're saying.
Right.
It's not 100% perfect, but it's useful. It's
Right.
useful in many things in technology. I think we make a bad. And it's part of the game of kind of like overhyping stuff in order for people to get excited about it. But then at the same time, it's a slow slog through a lot of obstacles to get to the magic part. But
Right. Right.
I think that's also why, in terms of going back to the multicultural thing, teams inside companies need to reflect that. The culture, the cultural thing. Just not be so be more diverse in their how they're forming and also how they're thinking,
Yeah.
because then it reflects the reality of the world. Because going back to your point, any technology, any company right now that's doing technology is basically global. And it's not by sectors. It's really, once you put your website on the internet and start putting stuff on like we're doing here in the podcast and stuff like that, I mean, you're basically up for the rest of the world to listen to you or read you or do anything. And you need to reflect that. It's and I'm glad we're having this conversation, because it's very rare that I can talk to people about this. The cultural part.
It's a tough conversation, especially having grown up and traveled, having the benefit of having traveled a great deal since a very young age. I've sort of been tuned into this conversation in different forms for a long time. It's always fascinated me, but never as much as it does today, because, as you said, you have no choice but to be a global company. The minute you're out there on the web, you're global, and it raises the stakes for all of us. Unfortunately, however, especially for the U.S., because we are such a large nation and can do business within our own borders very effectively, we don't often take account of those other cultural disparities and differences. I don't think you can do that any longer. I think that those days they're long gone. So you have to have this ability to be both culturally sensitive and to build technology that understands the nuance of cultural differences. And that will continue to be a huge challenge. I mean, AI is not going to take care of this. That's not what I'm proposing. What I am saying is that's a huge challenge. We have to recognize it, and we have to build it into the technology over time. Look, at the end of the day, in my mind, part of the richness of all innovation comes from its diversity. The diversity of the people, the situations that you encounter, the context, the crises, all these different things shape innovation in ways that you could never possibly have imagined. So I don't see this as a bad thing. I see what we're going through right now, these many conversations about all these topics, as being a very good thing. This makes us more aware. And in some ways, you said this to me last time you and I chatted. In some ways, you had a colleague who said, AI makes me a better person. What a wonderful way to look at this, right? AI is a better person. I'm becoming more aware of myself, my culture, my surroundings. But part of why we called the book Revealing the Invisible was because I really believe that innovation going forward will be about things that we can't see, that we can't necessarily touch or feel. So we'll still have planes and cars. We'll still have, homes that we'll live in and office buildings. That's not going to change. What will change is what's behind the scenes, all that invisible stuff. And culture is one of those invisible things. And I find that a fascinating conversation to have.
Yeah, I think we have to continue to talk about this in the perspective of how much positivity it brings. It's bringing it, and it'll keep bringing.
Right.
And like you said, of course, there's going to be people who use it for bad stuff. But as long as there's more of us that are using it for the right stuff, I mean, I think we're right. We're on our way. So is there anything else that you like to add, that you like people to take away from our chat? I don't want to take too much of your time.
Yeah, no. This has been a lot of fun. You're a blast to talk to because a lot of these topics end up being somewhat philosophical. They end up getting into areas that I think we have to stop and think about. So it's fun to have these conversations with you. I guess to bring it sort of back down to earth. Maybe the most important lesson from the book at the end of the day is that none of this is going to put us as humans out of business. What it will do is create more opportunities for us to do what humans really are good at. And maybe we don't, going back to that comment a few minutes ago, maybe we don't all of us get what we're really good at. So we're stuck doing things that pay well or that, help us to build careers and professions, but maybe we don't really get what we're best at. And that's what frightens us, is that AI is going to force us to really ask that question. So,
That's a good comment.
What are you really, really good at? There's no greater question in my mind. And if we can repurpose humanity to do more of that meaningful stuff, and not just the 2 billion of us who are lucky enough to live on more than a few dollars a day, but the whole 10 billion, then we will have achieved something that has been an elusive goal for so very long. That's a very cool end game in my mind, is trying to involve all 10 billion of our inhabitants somehow in the this global system that a few of us today benefit from. But it's not going to put humans out of business. If anything, it'll elevate the human condition and create a situation that I truly believe we will look back on one day and say, my God, how could we ever have been so awful to ourselves? How could we have done these terrible things to humanity and not realize, just live with them, just accepted them? They'll be unacceptable. And that will be because of the technology, but also because we will, as a species, have evolved because of this.
I like that.
That's cool.
I like that, Tom. I like that because it goes to your point of revealing the invisible, and I think that's kind of like the invisible part that people are not looking at. That we're too focused on what we're already doing, that the moment it gets taken away from us, we don't know what's up. and you might find something even better, which is I agree with you on that point, of not being scared of change.
Yeah, we're scared of our own potential as a species.
Exactly.
In some cases, I think.
Exactly.
Cool stuff.
So Tom, where can people find you?
So they can find me. I'm pretty easy to find. My Twitter handle is TK Speaks. If you spell Koulopoulos any which way, you'll probably find me on Google. The book, Revealing the Invisible, is on Amazon. It's at bookstores. And I love having these conversations with you, George. Thank you so much for giving me the chance to share a bit.
No, thank you so much for joining me and sharing your insight and perspective.
You bet. My pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Take care.